Most people don't stop at a crosswalk. They calculate, they hesitate, they look away. But that morning, Sophie didn't. The light had already turned red, cars idling in a long, impatient line, engines humming like a warning under the gray Chicago sky, and Sophie Carter was late, again. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket, a reminder she didn't need. Her manager's last message still burned into her mind. One more late shift, and you're done. She tightened her grip on her worn canvas bag, sneakers slapping against the damp pavement as she rushed toward the intersection on 5th and Wabash, weaving through people who all seemed to move with purpose, except one. He stood at the edge of the curb, just inches from the street, unmoving, his posture straight but uncertain, a white cane resting lightly in his hand. Cars rolled past in blurs of silver and black, the crosswalk signal flashing red, and still, he didn't step forward, didn't step back. Sophie slowed. Just for a second. She could make it if she kept walking. Maybe even clock in with 30 seconds to spare. But something about him felt wrong. Not just that he was blind, but the way everyone else moved around him, like he wasn't even there. Like he didn't exist. Her jaw tightened. Seriously? She muttered under her breath, glancing at the crowd. No one stopped. No one even looked. The countdown timer ticked down, 7, 6, 5. Sophie exhaled sharply, already knowing she'd made the decision before her brain caught up. "Hey, sir," she called out, stepping toward him. He turned slightly at the sound of her voice, his expression calm, unreadable. Up close, she noticed how well put together he looked despite the situation. Dark wool coat, polished shoes, not a single thread out of place. Not what she expected. "Do you need help crossing?" she asked, softer now. There was a brief pause. Then, a small nod. "If it's not too much trouble." His voice was low, steady, controlled in a way that didn't quite match the chaos around them. Sophie didn't question it. She slipped her hand gently around his arm, careful, respectful. "It's green in a second," she said, glancing at the signal. 3, 2, 1. The walk sign blinked on. "Okay, we're good." They stepped forward together. The city noise swelled around them. Honking horns, the distant rumble of a bus, footsteps rushing past. But for a moment, everything narrowed to the rhythm of their steps. He didn't rush, didn't hesitate either, just walked beside her, matching her pace perfectly. Halfway across, a gust of wind cut through the street, sharp and cold. Sophie shivered, tightening her coat, but she didn't let go. Not until they reached the other side. "There you go," she said, releasing his arm gently. "You're all set." He didn't move right away. Instead, he turned slightly toward her, as if trying to see her without seeing her. "Thank you," he said. Most people wouldn't have stopped. Sophie gave a small shrug, already stepping back. "Yeah, well, they should." Her phone buzzed again. She didn't check it. She already knew what it meant. But for some reason, standing there in the cold, she didn't regret it. Not even a little. Behind her, traffic surged forward again. In front of her, the man adjusted his grip on the cane. And for just a split second, something about the way he stood, too precise, too aware, didn't feel like someone who couldn't see at all. But Sophie didn't notice. Not yet. Sophie barely made it half a block before her phone started vibrating again. This time longer, sharper, like it refused to be ignored. And she already knew what was waiting on the other side of that screen, so she did not slow down, did not look, just kept walking faster, her breath turning uneven as she pushed through the morning crowd, her mind replaying the ticking countdown at the crosswalk, the seconds she had willingly given away, the choice she had made without thinking, or maybe thinking too clearly. And by the time she reached the small corner cafe where she worked, the bell above the door had barely finished ringing before her manager's voice cut through the air, tight and controlled. "You are late again, Sophie." She stopped just inside the doorway, chest rising and falling, strands of her dark hair clinging to her cheek from the cold air outside. And for a moment she thought about explaining, about mentioning the man, the cane, the way. No one else had stopped, but something in her told her it would not matter, not here, not now. So she simply nodded, quiet, steady, "I know." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument, and when he sighed, rubbing his temple, she understood before he even said it. "I cannot keep doing this. I need people I can rely on." The words landed softly, but they stayed, and Sophie swallowed, forcing a small nod, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "I understand." No anger, no pleading, just acceptance, because she had learned a long time ago that sometimes losing something was the price of doing what felt right, even when no one else saw it that way. And within 10 minutes she was back outside again, the same gray sky stretching overhead. Only now her steps were slower, quieter, like the city had shifted just slightly around her, and she reached into her bag, pulling out the folded envelope that held what little she had left. Rent due in 4 days, no. Steady income, and a list of numbers that did not quite add up no matter how many times she tried. And still, when she thought back to the man at the crosswalk, the way his hand had rested lightly against her arm, trusting without hesitation, she did not feel regret, not even close. Across the street, traffic flowed again, people moving forward like nothing had happened, like that moment had not existed at all, and Sophie let out a slow breath, tucking the envelope back into her bag before starting down the sidewalk with no real destination, just the quiet determination to figure something out like she always did, one step at a time. And somewhere behind her, though she could not see it, a black sedan had been waiting at the corner longer than necessary, engine idling, its tinted window lowering just slightly as a pair of sharp, observant eyes followed her retreating figure with a focus that was anything but blind. And inside, the man from the crosswalk sat perfectly still, the white cane resting across his lap, untouched, as if it had already served its purpose, his voice low, almost thoughtful when he finally spoke. She did not hesitate. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror, unsure how to respond. But the man did not need an answer, his gaze still fixed ahead, calm, calculating, and something else beneath it, something quieter, almost unfamiliar, as he added, "Find out who she is." By late afternoon, the city had softened into that quiet, in-between hour where the rush faded but the lights had not fully come alive yet. And Sophie found herself back near the same intersection without planning to be there, her steps slowing as she recognized the familiar crosswalk lines, the hum of traffic, the steady rhythm of people passing by without noticing anything beyond their own path. And for a moment, she just stood there, hands tucked into her coat pockets, replaying the morning. In her mind like it had left something unfinished, something she could not quite explain, and then she saw him again. He stood in almost the exact same spot, cane in hand, postured just as composed as before, as if time had not moved at all for him while everything else had shifted, and Sophie frowned slightly, glancing at the signal, then back at him, a small breath escaping her lips. "You have got to be kidding me," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. But her feet were already moving before the thought had fully formed, and within seconds she was beside him again, the city noise swelling around them as the light changed. "Hey, it is you," she said, softer this time, a hint of disbelief in her voice. "Are you trying to cross again?" He turned toward her, just like before, that same calm expression settling into place, and for a brief second, something flickered behind it, something almost like recognition. "It seems I am," he replied evenly, his tone carrying a quiet steadiness that made it hard to tell whether this was coincidence or something else entirely. And Sophie studied him for a moment longer than she had that morning, noticing details she had missed before, the way his coat fit perfectly, the faint scent of something expensive and clean, the subtle confidence in the way he held himself, not lost, not uncertain, just still, and it made her pause, just for a second, before she shook it off and reached for his arm again. "All right, come on, the light is about to change," she said, guiding him gently as the walk signal blinked on. And once again they stepped forward together, the same rhythm, the same strange sense of focus in the middle of all that noise. But this time Sophie paid closer attention, to his steps, to the way he moved, to the fact that he never once hesitated, not even when a car turned sharply at the corner, not even when someone brushed past them too quickly. And something about it did not quite match the picture in her mind of someone who could not see. But she said nothing, not yet, and when they reached the other side, she did not let go immediately, her grip lingering just a fraction longer than before. "You know," she said slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied his face. "Most people do not end up at the exact same corner twice in one day by accident." And for the first time, there was a shift, subtle but real, a pause in his stillness, like a breath held just a second too long, before he answered, Perhaps not, his voice lower now, almost thoughtful, and Sophie tilted her head, curiosity edging into her expression. So what is it then? Bad luck? Or are you waiting for someone? The corner of his mouth lifted just slightly, not quite a smile, but something close, something that carried meaning without fully revealing it. Maybe I am waiting for the right person to stop, he said, and the words lingered in the air between them, quiet, deliberate, and for a moment Sophie did not know what to say, because something about the way he said it felt less like a guess and more like a certainty. And across the street, unnoticed by both of them, the same black sedan idled once more, the driver watching carefully, while inside, the man beside Sophie stood perfectly still, not as someone lost in the world, but as someone observing it in a way few others ever could, waiting, measuring, and for the first time in a long time, finding exactly what he had been looking for. Sophie did not leave right away this time, even after his words settled between them, because something about the moment felt different, like the city had slowed just enough for her to notice what everyone else kept missing, and she shifted her weight slightly, still standing close enough to hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, the faint rustle of his coat in the wind, and for reasons she could not fully explain, she found herself asking, "Do you need help getting somewhere else? Or was that it?" It was a simple question, but it carried more than just politeness, and he seemed to catch that, tilting his head just slightly as if considering something beyond the words themselves before answering. "I was planning to walk a bit further," he said, calm as ever. "But I suppose I could use some guidance." Sophie hesitated for half a second, her mind flicking back to the list of things she should be doing instead, job applications, calls she needed to make, numbers that did not work no matter how many times she rearranged them. But then she exhaled quietly and gave a small nod, more to herself than to him. "All right, I can walk with you for a bit," she said, already stepping forward, her hand finding his arm again with the same careful ease as before, and together they moved down the sidewalk, away from the intersection, into a quieter stretch where the noise of traffic softened into the background and the city felt less rushed, less demanding. "So where are we headed?" she asked after a moment, glancing ahead as if expecting a destination to appear, but his answer came without direction. "Forward," he said simply, and Sophie let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "That is not exactly helpful," she replied, though there was no frustration in her voice, just a quiet curiosity that kept growing with every step they took. Because the more time she spent around him, the more things did not quite add up, the way he never stumbled, never asked where they were, never seemed uncertain even in unfamiliar space, and she caught herself watching him again, more carefully this time. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a few blocks, slowing slightly as they approached another corner, and he nodded once. "Of course." She hesitated, choosing her words. "How long have you been on your own like this?" It was not the question she had first thought of, but it felt safer, easier to ask, and for a moment there was silence, the kind that did not feel empty but intentional, before he answered. "Long enough to learn that most people do not stop," his tone even, but carrying a weight that lingered just beneath the surface, and Sophie glanced down briefly, her grip on his arm tightening just a fraction. "Well, I guess I am not most people," she said quietly, almost without thinking, and this time, when he turned toward her, the shift was clearer, not just recognition, but something closer to interest, like he was seeing something he had not expected to find, even without using his eyes. And they continued walking like that, step by step, until they reached a small park tucked between buildings, the kind most people passed without noticing, and Sophie slowed again. "There is a bench up ahead," she said, guiding him gently toward it. "You can sit for a minute if you want." And when they stopped, she finally let go, stepping back slightly as he lowered himself onto the bench with a smooth, controlled motion that felt almost too precise. And for the first time since they met, Sophie did not look away, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she studied him, because the feeling had grown too strong to ignore now, that quiet sense that something about this man did not match the story he was presenting. And as the wind brushed through the trees above them, carrying the faint sound of the city beyond, she crossed her arms lightly and said, not accusing, not harsh, but certain, "You know, for someone who cannot see, you never really seem lost." And the words hung there, soft but undeniable, as the man on the bench remained still for a moment longer than before, like a line had just been crossed that could not be stepped back from. And somewhere across the street, the black sedan remained parked once more, engine running, waiting. The air in the park shifted the moment her words settled, not louder, not colder, just clearer, like something unspoken had finally been placed between them where it could not be ignored anymore. And Sophie held her ground, her arms loosely crossed, her eyes steady on him, not accusing but no longer looking away either. Because whatever this was, it was not just coincidence anymore, not just a man needing help twice in the same day. And for a few seconds, he did not respond, sitting there with that same composed stillness, the white cane resting across his lap untouched, until finally, he exhaled, slow and controlled, like someone choosing a response carefully rather than reacting. "What makes you say that?" he asked, his voice calm. But this time there was something else in it, something more direct, more present. And Sophie let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, shaking her head slightly. "Because I have been walking with you for over 10 minutes now," she said, gesturing lightly toward the path they had just taken. "And not once did you hesitate. Not once did you ask where we were. Not even when the sidewalk changed or someone got too close." She paused, her expression softening just a little. "That is not how someone lost moves." The words were not harsh, just honest, and they hung there between them as the city noise drifted faintly through the trees. And for the first time since she had met him, he did not deflect right away, did not redirect or soften the moment. Instead, he sat there in silence, as if weighing something far heavier than the conversation itself. And then, slowly, he reached for the cane in his lap, his fingers brushing along its surface before lifting it slightly, not as support, but almost like a symbol. "You are observant," he said quietly, and there was a shift now, subtle but undeniable, like a door had just opened a fraction, and Sophie felt it, even if she could not fully see what was behind it yet. "So," she pressed gently, her voice steady, "am I wrong?" Another pause, longer this time, but not empty, filled with something that felt closer to decision than hesitation. And then, instead of answering directly, he turned slightly toward her, his posture changing just enough to feel different, less guarded, less distant. "Tell me something," he said, his tone calm but more focused now. "When you saw me this morning, why did you stop?" Sophie blinked, caught off guard by the shift, her arms lowering slightly as she considered the question. "Because you needed help," she answered simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, and he tilted his head just a fraction. "That is not what I asked," he replied, his voice still even. "There were dozens of people around. All of them saw the same thing you did. None of them stopped." Sophie frowned slightly, her mind flicking back to that moment, the crowd, the noise, the way everyone had kept moving like it was not their problem, and she shrugged lightly, searching for something deeper, but finding only the truth. "I do not know," she admitted, quieter now. "I just could not walk away." And that was it. No grand explanation, no dramatic reason, just a simple truth. And for the first time, something in his expression shifted in a way she could feel without seeing, something that was not calculation, not control, but recognition, like he had just heard the answer he had been waiting for. And he nodded once, slow, deliberate, before lowering the cane back across his lap. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly why I was standing there." The words settled between them, heavier than anything he had said before, and Sophie's brows pulled together slightly, confusion threading through her voice as she stepped closer without realizing it. "What does that mean?" she asked, and this time, when he turned toward her, there was no hesitation at all, just a calm certainty that felt like the beginning of something much larger than either of them had planned. "It means," he said, his voice low but clear, "you were never the one who got lucky enough to find me." A small pause. Then, softer but unmistakable, "I was looking for someone like you." And somewhere beyond the park, unseen but present, the city continued to move, unaware that in one quiet corner, something had just shifted that would change both of their lives in ways neither of them fully understood yet. Sophie did not move for a second after he said it, her mind trying to catch up to the weight behind those words, because there was something unsettling about the way he spoke, not dramatic, not emotional, just certain, like everything that had happened that day had been part of something planned long before she even stepped onto that street. And she let out a slow breath, shaking her head slightly as she stepped back, creating just a bit of space between them. "Okay. Now you are starting to sound a little mysterious on purpose," she said, her voice light, but her eyes sharp. "Searching, looking for someone like me? You do not even know me." He did not answer right away, and that silence again felt deliberate, controlled, like he was deciding how much to reveal and how much to keep. And when he finally spoke, his tone had changed, not louder, but clearer, more grounded in something real. "I know enough," he said simply, and before she could respond, the sound of footsteps approached from behind them, steady, precise, and Sophie turned slightly, her brows furrowing as she saw a man in a dark suit walking toward them with quiet urgency, his posture straight, his expression professional but focused, and when he stopped a few feet away, he did not even look at her first, his attention going directly to the man on the bench. "Sir," he said respectfully, "the car is ready." The word landed differently than it should have, not casual, not polite, but practiced, and Sophie felt something tighten in her chest as her gaze flicked back to the man beside her, who had not reacted with surprise or confusion, only a slight nod, as if this had always been expected. "Give me a minute," he replied calmly, and the man in the suit stepped back without question, waiting. Sophie blinked, her eyes moving between them, the pieces starting to shift into place in a way she had not anticipated. "Wait? What is that?" she asked, her voice quieter now, less certain, and for the first time since they met, he turned fully toward her, not just listening, but facing her in a way that felt different, more direct, and then slowly, deliberately, he reached down and set the white cane beside him on the bench, not dropped, not forgotten, but placed there like something he no longer needed in that moment. And then he stood up, not carefully, not hesitantly, but smoothly, naturally, like someone who had done it 1,000 times without thinking, and Sophie's breath caught before she could stop it, her eyes widening just slightly as she watched him straighten his coat, adjust his sleeve, and then finally look at her, not past her, not toward her voice, but directly at her, his gaze steady, clear, unmistakably focused, and everything inside her stilled for a second as the realization settled in, slow but undeniable. You can see," she said, almost under her breath, not accusing, just trying to understand. And he held her gaze without flinching, without looking away, because there was no reason to pretend anymore. "Yes," he answered quietly, and the simplicity of it hit harder than any explanation could have, and Sophie took a small step back, her mind racing, replaying every moment, every step, every word, the crosswalk, the way he never hesitated, the way he had been waiting, and she let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "So this whole time, what was that?" she asked, not angry, not yet, just confused, searching for something that made sense, and for a moment, he said nothing, just stood there in front of her, no longer hidden behind anything. And then he glanced briefly toward the street beyond the park, where the black sedan now waited at the curb, sleek and silent, before looking back at her again, his expression calm but no longer distant. "That," he said, his voice steady, "was the only way to see who would stop when there was nothing to gain." The words settled between them, heavier than anything before, and Sophie felt it. The shift, the truth behind what had seemed like coincidence now unfolding into something far more intentional, far more controlled. And for the first time since this all began, she was not sure whether to feel chosen or tested. Sophie stared at him, the distance between them suddenly feeling much larger than the few steps she had taken back, and for a moment, the city noise seemed to fade into something distant and unimportant, because all she could hear was the echo of his words repeating in her mind, the only way to see who would stop, and she let out a quiet breath, shaking her head slowly. "So that is what I was to you?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying something sharper now, not anger exactly, but something close to it, a test. He did not interrupt her, did not try to soften it, and that almost made it worse, because it meant he understood exactly what she was feeling, and she took another small step back, her arms crossing again, this time not out of habit but protection. "You stood there, pretending you needed help, just to see who would give it?" Her eyes searched his face, trying to find something that made it make sense, something human beneath all that control. Do you have any idea how that feels? The man in front of her did not flinch, but something in his expression shifted, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for someone who had been watching closely. And when he spoke, his voice was still calm, but no longer distant. Yes, he said quietly, and that single word landed heavier than any explanation could have, because it was not defensive, not dismissive, just honest. And Sophie hesitated for a second, caught off guard by it, before her brows pulled together again. Then, why? She pressed, her voice lower now, more personal. Why go through all of that instead of just asking for help like a normal person? There was a pause, not empty, but full of something that felt older than the moment itself, and he glanced briefly toward the street, the waiting car, the world that clearly belonged to him, before looking back at her. Because when you have everything, he said slowly, people do not help you. They perform for you. The words were measured, controlled, but there was something beneath them, something worn, like a truth learned the hard way. They smile, they offer, they agree, but it is never about you. It is about what you represent. Sophie's expression softened just slightly, not in agreement, but in understanding, because even if her world looked nothing like his, she recognized that feeling of being unseen in a different way, and she let out a quiet breath, her arms loosening just a little. So you pretend to have nothing, just to see who still shows up, she said, more to herself than to him, and he nodded once. Exactly. Another silence followed, but this one felt different, less sharp, more reflective, and Sophie looked down for a moment, processing, before glancing back up at him, her eyes still searching. And what happens after you find them? She asked, her tone quieter now, more careful, and for the first time since the truth came out, something almost like a faint smile touched his expression, subtle but real. That depends, he said, his gaze steady on hers, on whether they walk away or stay. The answer lingered, and Sophie felt it, the weight of what he was really asking without saying it directly. And she looked at him for a long second, this man who had stood in the middle of a busy street pretending to be invisible, who had watched the world pass him by just to find one person who would not. And she shook her head slightly, a small, almost disbelieving breath escaping her lips. You know, most people would be really angry right now, she said, her voice softer, not quite a joke, not quite serious, and he tilted his head just a fraction. And you are not? He asked, and she paused, considering that honestly, before answering. I am, a little, she admitted, a faint, reluctant smile flickering at the corner of her mouth. But I also kind of get it. That was not the answer he expected, and for a brief moment, it showed, not in surprise, but in the way his expression shifted just enough to reveal something real beneath the surface, and the space between them, which had felt so wide just seconds ago, seemed to narrow again, not completely, but enough to change the direction of where this was going, because now it was no longer just about a test, it was about what came after it. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet between them no longer tense but charged with something deeper, something that felt like a turning point neither of them had planned but both had stepped into anyway. And Sophie shifted her weight slightly, glancing past him toward the street where the black sedan waited, its presence now impossible to ignore. So what now? She asked, her voice steady but carrying a quiet edge of curiosity. You found what you were looking for. What does that mean for me? It was not a demand, not an accusation, just a simple question that deserved a real answer, and Daniel did not look away this time, did not retreat behind silence or distance. Instead, he took a small step closer, closing part of the space between them, his posture still composed but no longer guarded. It means, he said slowly, that I do not walk away from something real when I find it. The words were calm, but there was intention behind them now, something deliberate that made Sophie's breath catch just slightly before she could hide it, and she crossed her arms again, though this time it felt less like defense and more like grounding herself in the moment. That sounds important, she said, a faint hint of skepticism in her tone, but it still does not explain what you expect from me. Daniel paused, considering that, and then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, pulling out a small, simple card, nothing flashy, just clean white with a name and number printed in understated black, and he held it out to her, not forcing it, just offering it. I expect nothing, he said, his voice steady. But I would like to give you a choice. Sophie hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing lightly against his for just a second before she pulled the card back and looked down at it, her eyes scanning the name, Daniel Whitmore, and beneath it, a title that made her pause, her brows pulling together as the reality of it settled in more fully. C.O. Whitmore Group, and she let out a quiet breath, shaking her head slightly as if trying to process how quickly everything had shifted. This is a lot, she admitted, her voice softer. Now, less guarded, and when she looked back up at him, there was something different in her expression, not just curiosity, but the beginning of understanding the scale of what she had stepped into. You really do not do anything halfway, do you? A faint smile touched his expression again, subtle but genuine. No, he said simply, and then he gestured lightly toward the city around them, the buildings, the streets, the movement that never seemed to stop. I built my life on seeing what others overlook, he continued. And today, that was you. The words settled differently this time, not as a test, not as a challenge, but as recognition, and Sophie felt it, even if she was not ready to fully accept it yet. And she looked back down at the card in her hand, turning it slightly between her fingers as if weighing more than just paper. And if I say no? She asked after a moment, her voice quiet but firm, because that mattered too, the ability to walk away, to not be pulled into something she did not choose. And Daniel nodded once without hesitation. Then you walk away, he said, just as calmly as before. And nothing changes. He meant it, she could tell, not as a line, not as persuasion, but as truth. And that made the choice feel even heavier, not lighter, because now it was entirely hers. And Sophie let out a slow breath, looking up at him again, at the man who had stood in the middle of a crowded street pretending to be invisible just to find someone who would see him anyway. And she shook her head slightly, a small, almost incredulous smile forming as she tucked the card into her pocket. You know, most people meet over coffee, she said lightly, though her eyes stayed locked on his, not in the middle of a social experiment. This time, his smile was a little more visible, though still restrained. Most people are not looking for the same things I am, he replied, and the honesty in that answer lingered, simple but undeniable, and for a moment, the city seemed to pause around them again, just long enough for Sophie to realize that whatever this was, it was not over, not even close, it was only just beginning. And somewhere between the crosswalk and this quiet park bench, her life had shifted onto a path she had never planned, one that now stood open in front of her, waiting for her to decide whether to walk it or leave it behind. Sophie did not answer right away, not because she did not have something to say, but because for the first time that day, she understood the weight of her choice, and she stood there in the quiet edge of the park, the city moving behind her, the card resting in her pocket like something far more significant than paper, and she looked at Daniel Whitmore not as the man from the crosswalk anymore, not as the stranger with the cane, but as someone who had stepped into her world in the most unexpected way and then turned it inside out without raising his voice once. And she let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing as the tension she had been holding all afternoon finally began to settle. You know what is funny, she said softly, her eyes still on him. This morning, I thought I was the one running late. Like everything in my life was falling behind. She paused, shaking her head just slightly. And now it feels like I just walked straight into something I was not even looking for. Daniel did not interrupt, did not try to guide her response. He simply stood there, listening, the way he had been from the beginning. And that mattered more than anything he had said so far. And Sophie reached in her pocket, pulling out the card again, turning it once between her fingers before looking back up at him. I do not like being tested, she continued, her tone honest, but no longer sharp. And I definitely do not like being part of something I did not agree to, she met his gaze directly, but I also do not walk away from something that feels real either. The words settled between them, clear, steady, and for the first time since the truth had come out, the uncertainty shifted into something closer to direction, and Daniel nodded once, not as approval, but as acknowledgement, like he understood exactly what she meant without needing anything more. And Sophie slipped the card back into her pocket, this time with intention, not hesitation. So here is what is going to happen, she said, a faint, determined edge in her voice now. If I call that number, It is not because you chose me. It is because I am choosing to see where this goes." There was no challenge in her tone, just clarity, and something in Daniel's expression changed again, not dramatically, but enough to reveal a quiet respect that had not been there before. "That is the only way it should be," he replied, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the space between them no longer uncertain, just open, like a path waiting to be taken, and then Sophie stepped back once more. But this time it did not feel like distance, it felt like a beginning, and she gave him a small, almost amused smile. "Next time, though," she added lightly, "you might want to try just saying hello." A subtle smile touched his face in return. "I will consider it," he said, and there was something almost human in the simplicity of that exchange, something that had not been there when they first met. And as Sophie turned to leave, her steps steady, her mind clearer than it had been all day, she glanced once over her shoulder, just long enough to see him still standing there. No cane, no disguise, just a man in a city that finally felt a little less distant than before. And as she disappeared into the flow of people, Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer before turning toward the waiting car. But this time, there was no need to watch, no need to test, because for once, he had already seen what he needed to see. And across the street, the crosswalk light shifted again, green to red, red to green. The same